Welcome to Toyota Time with Timmy the Toolman and Sean. We have a special guest here today, my buddy Aaron,
Sick mods,
who hails from Petaluma, California. Beautiful city that it is. And what we're going to do with Aaron today is we're going to do a suspension renewal on his 1994 FJ80 Land Cruiser. And you're thinking, Land Cruiser? Timmy the Toolman and Sean don't work on Land Cruisers. Well, yeah, we do now, because we like all Toyota SUVs and trucks, so we're not discriminating. What we're going to install on Aaron's 94 Land Cruiser is an OME suspension upgrade. So we're not going to do a suspension lift. These OME springs, shocks, and steering stabilizer are just going to replace the OEM Toyota spec springs, shocks, and stabilizer. So they are a OEM replacement. You obviously have choices in the suspension components you put on your Land Cruiser, but OME has been a tried and true manufacturer of suspension components, and that's why Aaron decided to go with OME. So here's everything that Aaron bought. We're not going to bother unboxing it because you're going to see the components as we're installing them. Front springs, rear springs, front shock absorbers, rear shock absorbers, and a steering stabilizer. What's nice about the Land Cruiser compared to, say, a third gen 4Runner is the springs and shocks are separate, so you don't have to go about compressing springs with those scary spring compressors and get a new shock absorber installed. These are all separate, so it makes it a little bit more straightforward and a little less scary. We're going to work on the front suspension first. So we're going to jack up the front end, get the frame supported on 6-ton jack stands. We're going to get the wheels off, and we're going to get started on this job. All right, so the factory service manual says the first step you want to do is you want to disconnect the upper shock connection, which is inside the engine bay. So you have to lift up the hood to get access to the upper shock connection. So on the driver's side, it's right underneath the master cylinder. So here's your master cylinder. You look right down below and you see the driver's side upper shock mount connection. It has a little flat section on the top of the shock shaft, and you need to hold that steady while you get onto the nut with a 19mm wrench so you can loosen the nut, because without holding the shock shaft still, the whole thing will turn on you. So you have to hold this firm in order to get the nut loose. Here on the passenger side, you can see it's a lot easier to get access to this upper shock mount connection. There's nothing in the way, so we can most likely get on this one with the impact gun. The other side, we're going to have to do something different, and we're going to figure that out. So we figured out what's going to work for this driver's side upper shock connection. We're going to use a 6-inch size vice grips, and then we're going to use a flex head gear wrench ratcheting 19mm box end wrench. We're going to slide over the box end wrench onto the nut first and then get our vice grips attached. I'm going to get on here with the wrench and I'm going to turn it, and you can see the whole shaft is turning with the nut. It's not loosening up. We're going to get the flat sides of the shaft parallel with the sides of the vehicle, and then that's going to enable us to get in here with a vice grips in this area right here to where we can clamp onto it. First, I'm going to get my 19mm box end wrench onto the nut, and now I'm going to get my vice grips in place. So you just want to be clamping on the flat sides of the upper part of the shaft. You don't want to be clamping on the threads. You get a good bite on there. If you have somebody helping you, that would be ideal. One person holds the vice grips firm, the other person works the ratchet. Aaron and I already broke this loose, so we know we can get it, but we just wanted to show you the setup of how we did it. I held on to the vice grips and Aaron turned the nut and broke it free. So we're going to get it off the rest of the way. I saw that the shaft is no longer spinning, so I'm going to get the vice grips off the end of the shaft. The nut's almost free of the shaft. Oh, it's turning all the way still. It started spinning a little bit, but what Aaron is doing is he's holding the upper part of the shock still, and that also works. Got the nut off. You could take this top washer off that goes against the bushing, and then we should be able to just pull this upper bushing off like that. After I removed the vice grips off the top of the shaft and the shock spindle started spinning on me, Aaron grabbed onto here. Now, if you found that the vice grips wasn't working for you and you couldn't get the nut free, what you can do is you can get onto this upper part of the shock with just a big old channel locks and clamp on it really tight and basically start smashing it. And you would need somebody's help underneath here holding this while you work the ratchet up above, but this is another option. I've actually used the channel locks method when taking off the rear shocks on my 3rd gen 4Runner. I just clamped on it and squeezed really tight and held it still while I was working the ratchet up above. So this is another possibility if the vice grips don't work for you up above. Now on the passenger side, we're going to see if an impact gun will spin that upper shock nut off without us having to hold the shaft. Let's give it a try. I have a deep 19mm socket, medium length 1/2 inch extension, and my big 1/2 inch Dewalt gun. Nope, the whole thing's spinning. So just for kicks, we're gonna use the big channel locks. Aaron's gonna get on there, and then I'm gonna try to spin it off with the gun and see if that works. So with Aaron firmly holding the upper part of the shock, now I'm going to see if I could spin this 19mm nut off. Just like downtown.
Sweet.
So now we're ready to disconnect the lower shock connection to the axle, and the spindle has the same setup. It has flat edges to it to where you can grab onto it with a vice grips or maybe a crescent wrench, hold the spindle steady, and then get a 19mm box end wrench, ratcheting preferably, and loosen it. What we're going to do is going to try something different. We're going to hold onto the lower part of the shaft with a big pair of channel locks, and then I'm going to get on the nut with my impact gun and see if we can get it loose. Because let me show you what happens if you don't hold the shock steady. It's going to turn. See, the whole thing turns. So I'm now going to have Aaron clamp onto this with a big pair of channel locks, and you'll see we'll be able to get it loose. Okay, Aaron's got a good bite with the big channel locks, and now I'm gonna see if I can spin this off with the gun. And there it is, it's off. The bottom hardware is the same as the top hardware. After you get the nut off, you have a washer. You could just pry it off if it's a little sticky. These washers might fight you, so what helps is just turning it lefty-loosey and it will spin off. Have somebody hold the shock steady for you, and you could just spin it right off the threads. The driver's side came off a lot easier, but this side is just fighting us a little bit. So you spin it off, you can pull the bushing off, and now we need to compress the shock to get it disconnected. Okay, so what Aaron's gonna do is he's just gonna use his man strength, or girl strength if you're a girl, and he's just gonna pull straight down on the top of the shock absorber to compress it and then free the spindle of the upper connection. He's gonna keep on pulling down, pulling down, pulling down. He'll compress quite a bit. And now he can pull up and free the shock absorber, just like that. The next thing the instructions say to do is we have to disconnect the sway bar on both sides, driver and passenger, and we're gonna disconnect the sway bar at this connection to the axle. So Aaron is holding the bolt head with a 14mm box end wrench. I'm on the back side with my little Dewalt 3/8 gun with a 14mm socket, and I'm gonna see if I could spin this nut off. Okay, the nut's off. So because the ABS line is in our way of pulling this sway bar bolt out, it's got to come out towards the outside of the vehicle. We're gonna take out this one 12mm bolt further to the outside. It holds this line on. Hopefully once we get this disconnected, we can get the bolt out. So again, I'm just using my gun with a 12mm socket and just zip this out. So I got this loose. Yeah, that's gonna work out just fine. So now I can remove the sway bar bolt. On this passenger side connection of the sway bar to the axle, you have the differential in your way and you can't really easily get a straight shot if you want to use an impact gun. So I'm going to connect up a swivel and see if I could still use the impact gun. If not, then I'm going to have to just use another wrench on the 14mm nut. I have a long box end holding the bolt head firm, and I'm going to get on here with my 14mm socket and see if I could spin this off. And there we go. It worked. And we got the sway bar now disconnected on both sides. We're going to work on getting the springs disconnected. On the top of the mount where the spring goes in, you have two 12mm nuts. And what those 12mm nuts are holding is this piece right here. You have to get those nuts free so when you pull the spring out, this thing comes with it. So I'm just using a long 12mm box end wrench and I'm going to loosen these up. The back one's a little bit harder to get to because it's right next to the shock mount, but you can get in there with the long wrench. And then once it's free, if you have a ratcheting box end wrench, then it'll be easier to get them loose. So now that both of the two 12mm nuts are off, now what we need to do is we need to droop the front axle. So currently we have the hydraulic jack underneath the front axle. I'm going to lower it down to where we can droop it enough to where we can lever these springs out. So to help Aaron, I'm going to stand on the end of the axle and then he should be able to lever that spring out. We got it. Bingo. So to give you an idea, this is what the two 12mm nuts were holding on. So that's why you had to remove these first in order to get the spring out. So we're going to do the same on the driver's side. We're going to take the two 12mm nuts out first. We're going to flex the axle and we're going to get the spring out. Two things we noticed when flexing the front axle to get the springs out is there's two things that are getting tight. This brake line and this breather line. The factory service manual doesn't say anything about disconnecting these, but we think it might be smart to do so. You can see right here that the breather line is actually already starting to slide off from us flexing the front end. So this is just a really light clamp. You could take that off and slip that off. This brake line connection is a 14mm nut on this back side, and I already loosened it up, and we're going to disconnect this. This way it's going to allow us just a little bit more flex to get the new springs in, because the new springs are new and they are just a little bit taller than the ones we just took out because the other ones compressed over time. So now that that's loose, the axle can flex a little more without pulling on the brake line. As you can see right here, I'm flexing it right now. So here's the two original springs we just took off the vehicle, driver side, passenger side, and then here's the two new springs. What we noticed with the old ones and the new ones is one is taller than the other. So the reason why the driver's side spring is taller is for two reasons. One, it's to compensate for the weight of the driver. A lot of times you just have a single person driving the vehicle. And the other big reason is the fuel tank is on that driver's side. So the fuel tank with a full tank of gas is gonna weigh quite a bit. So it would be like carrying a bunch of cargo just on the driver's side all the time. So that's why they have a little bit of a taller spring on that driver's side. So the rig isn't leaning because of the extra weight of the driver and the fuel in the gas tank. Let's look at these springs now and how they're labeled. So it looks like the way OME labeled these springs is the taller of the two springs is labeled with a B and the shorter spring is labeled with an A. So the B spring goes on the driver's side, the A spring goes on the passenger side. So reversing our order, we're gonna take this little Chingadera shock absorber doohickey. It's basically a bump stop. We're gonna slide this into the new spring. Now see this kind of arrow appendage? That goes towards the corner over here. You can see the way it's shaped. It needs to go in that corner. So I'm gonna get this in, and then he's gonna step on this to flex the axle a little bit so I can get it in further.
1, 2, 3.
Okay, we've got it slid over the bottom. Now we have to line up the studs for this bump stop. You lift up a little bit on the spring. You get your 12mm nuts started, and there we go. Once you get it in there, you could just hold the cone and get them tight. What we learned on the other side is the torque spec for these little 12mm nuts is pretty light. It's 82 inch-pounds, and when we got it to the spec, we just didn't feel like that was tight enough, so we decided to go a little bit higher and tighten them up a little bit more with our box end 12mm wrench. I have my inch-pound torque wrench set to 82 inch-pounds. That's 82 inch-pounds there. You can get on the back one, no problem. And we got them both to the spec. But like I said, we feel like it should be just a little bit tighter than that. So I'm going just maybe another quarter turn with the box end wrench, and then we're calling it good. So see how this has a little stop right here on the axle? You want the end of the spring turned to where it's right up against that stop. Now that we have both springs in position, the instructions say to get the sway bar reconnected. So we're gonna jack up under the axle and get it a little higher to where we can get the sway bar connected easier. How's that looking, Aaron? Does it look like we can line it up or go higher?
One more. Right there.
We've got the bolt and nut capturing the sway bar on the driver's side of the axle, and we noticed that it's a little bit harder to get the passenger side lined up. So you have to play with the height of the axle in order to get these bolt holes for the sway bar to line up. It looks like I got it lined up pretty good now. The bolt goes in from the outside in, and then once you got it slid through, then you just get your 14mm nut on. Now we're gonna torque these sway bar bolts to spec. The spec is 19 foot-pounds. So I have Aaron holding the bolt head with a 14mm box end wrench, and I have my 3/8 torque wrench on the inside on the nut with a 14mm socket. And there we go, 19 foot-pounds. We're gonna get the other side tight now. Now that we have the springs in on both sides, we're gonna reconnect the ABS brackets that we disconnected. So the first one is right here near the driver's side shock absorber. I'm gonna get this little 12mm bolt back in. I'm not gonna bother with a torque spec with this. I'm just gonna get it snug and call it good. It's a small bolt, so you see that I have a long ratchet. I'm gonna choke up on this to get less mechanical advantage. So right there, that's good enough, just nice and snug. The next thing we're gonna connect is this breather line. I'm just gonna slip it over and then compress this clamp with my hand and get it in position. Now we gotta reconnect this one with the 14mm bolt. It just threads right back into the axle tube. I'm not gonna bother worrying about a torque spec for this. I'm just gonna cinch it up snug and call it good. For the shocks, this is the hardware that comes with it. Each top and bottom section has 2 bushings. It has this special washer. It has 2 other washers that capture the bushing, and then it has the nut that goes either on the top or the bottom. So 2 identical packages of hardware. The shock comes compressed for you. It has this special clamp on here to keep it compressed. So this is the bottom and this is the top. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna slide off this little cardboard protector for the threads of the shock. This is the lower end. We're first gonna slide on one of these washers. It has 2 distinct sides, this side and this side. This side is a little bit more concave, and that concave side faces the bushing. So you'd wanna slide this on first, then you'd wanna get one of your elastomers and put it on. And this is gonna slide in just like this on the lower connection. On the bottom, we're gonna slide this one on with a little protrusion facing the frame member. So it's gonna go on like this on the opposite side of the frame member. And then we're gonna put a bushing, and then again, the concave side of this washer like this, and then the nut's gonna go on. So that's gonna be the order. But first, what we're gonna do is we're gonna get the top set up also. So again, it's gonna be a concave side of this flat washer first. We're gonna get a bushing, and then we're gonna get this special washer on top with the, again, the protrusion facing up. So this is gonna go into the frame member. Now what we're gonna do is we're gonna disconnect this, and the shock absorber is slowly gonna gain length as the shock absorber uncompresses. So you can just slide this off with your hand, and now the shock absorber is going to slowly start rising. So I'm going to get this in here, and I'm going to slide it in the bottom connection, and then I'm just going to watch from below, and I'm going to slowly watch the shock absorber go into the top mount. And hopefully you got a good aim. You can find the hole. Sometimes I have a problem with that, or sometimes I find the wrong hole. Aaron is up above helping me find the hole. When you have a good buddy, he'll help you find the hole.
I'm basically just putting my finger on top of it, guiding.
Yeah, put your finger in it.
It's making its way through the hole.
It's making its way through its hole. Sometimes you need a buddy to tell you that. Don't put it in your buddy's hole.
Yeah, we're good.
We're good? Okay. So now we're gonna get the bottom hardware connected on the other side of the axle connection. So again, this protrusion faces up. This little protrusion sits into the connection on the axle. So I'm gonna get in here on my back. You wanna make sure that it sits in there flush. You get your elastomer or bushing on there. Then you get the washer with the concave side facing the bushing. And then you get your nut on. Okay, now we're gonna go up above and we're gonna get the upper bushing connected to the opposite side. So we're up above on the passenger side, and my little pointer tool is pointing at the top of that special washer with the protrusion. It's sitting right in the diameter of this upper shock mount. If you're following the OME instructions, they say next to put a elastomer or bushing on top with the washer and the nut. But what we noticed is Toyota had an additional washer with a little protrusion that will fit in the inner diameter of the other special washer. So we're gonna choose to reuse these special washers that the Toyota setup came with. So this one will fit right in the inner diameter of the other one. Next, we're gonna get our bushing, then the flat washer with the concave side facing the bushing. And then we're just gonna get the nut on there, hand tight. We're now going to torque the lower shock nut to 51 foot-pounds. And as you're tightening it, you're going to notice that the whole thing is going to spin. See how it's spinning on us? On the other side, Aaron was just able to hold it with his hands, and we got it pretty close to the spec. But then at one point, he can't hold it tight enough to get it up to the spec. So what we're going to utilize is a strap wrench. A strap wrench is something nice that will hold a cylindrical object really firm just with friction. So depending on the style of strap wrench you have, this one is made by Craftsman. You want to set it up in such a way to where you can put force going the opposite way the shock absorber is going to want to turn. So as I tighten the bottom 19mm nut, the shock absorber is going to want to turn this direction towards the front. So we need to put the strap wrench onto where we can apply force in the opposite direction to hold it still. So I'm going to slide the strap around the shock absorber. I'm going to feed it in. I'm going to cinch it up tight. And then Aaron is going to hold it, camming it towards the back of the rig to hold the lower part of the shock steady while I get the nut to the spec. This nut is a 19mm. So I just have my 3/8 inch torque wrench set to 51 foot-pounds with a short 3/8 extension and the short 19mm socket. He's getting there now.
Yep, we're getting there.
Okay, you got a good grip?
Yep.
There it is, 51 foot-pounds. Similar to the way we got the upper connections loose, the top part of the OME shock shaft has flat edges to it to where you can grab onto it with a crescent wrench or a vice grips. Right now I have it captured with a small crescent wrench. And then I have my ratcheting 19mm box end wrench flex head on the nut. I'm just leaning over the engine bay, holding the crescent wrench firm while I'm using my left hand to tighten the nut. And it's working. The only question is, how are we gonna get this to the torque spec? And we'll figure that out next, but I'm gonna get this sort of tightened down. In order to attempt to get this at the torque spec, what we're gonna use is a long 3/8 extension, and then I'm gonna use a 19mm crow's foot. And when it comes to using a crow's foot with a torque wrench, you don't want to have it extending past where you can get more leverage. So basically, you want the crow's foot at a 90-degree angle to your torque wrench. If this was like this, now you're increasing your leverage and you're going to get an improper spec. You want to keep it at a 90 degree to your torque wrench like that. Now utilizing the crescent wrench again, I'm going to get on here with the crow's foot. I'm going to hold the shock spindle steady with the crescent wrench, and I'm going to have Aaron hold this while I can just work the ratchet. So he's got the shock spindle steady. I was able to tighten it up to where it firmed up really tight just with the ratcheting wrench. So it's pretty much ready to hit the torque spec. Okay, it turned a little more than I thought. I have to reset the crow's foot. I'm going to get the crow's foot back at a 90 degree to the torque wrench. Get it back on there. Get back on with the crescent wrench. Okay, Aaron's going to hold it again. We'll see if we can get it this time. Let me reset it. Okay, Aaron's going to hold it again for me. Nope, still not there. Okay, let up. This thing's requiring more effort than we thought. There we go. We got it. 51 foot-pounds. Using a similar setup, but this time we're using a crescent wrench rather than the vice grips. I have the top of the spindle captured with the crescent wrench. I have my 19 millimeter flex head box end wrench tightening the nut. And you can't turn it very much. There's not a lot of room, so you're just gonna have to be patient and know that you're gonna be sitting here for a while tightening this nut. So we thought we wouldn't be able to get a torque wrench on there, but because we do have the crow's foot option, it looks like we can get on there. The extension's going right along the side of the master cylinder, and I'm still able to get in there with the crescent wrench on the top of the spindle, and we're gonna see if we can get this. Okay, stop. Once you turn it a little bit, you're gonna lose your 90 degree, so you're gonna have to reset. It's a test of patience. I'm gonna take this off and then reset this with the crow's foot 90 degrees to the torque wrench. Get it back on there. Utilizing the crow's foot on this driver's side did work. I was holding the spindle steady with the crescent wrench. Aaron got on there with the torque wrench and the crow's foot with the long extension, and we were actually able to get it to 51 foot-pounds. And it ends up that the same amount of threads is showing above the nut, 5 threads on both sides. So we know that we've got it correct. Now that we have the front shocks properly torqued to spec, the next thing we're gonna do is we're gonna install the stabilizer shock that Aaron bought for this job. Okay, we're underneath the rig, and here's the steering stabilizer. We still have the hydraulic jack underneath the axle, jacking up the front end a little bit for us, so we have more room to work. The steering stabilizer is hooked onto this steering arm with the 17 millimeter nut right here, and then on the passenger side there's a bracket that is bolted to the front cross member, and there's another 17 millimeter nut attaching the stabilizer bar to the bracket right here. So what I'm going to utilize is a long 17 millimeter box end wrench to give me enough leverage to break it free. So you can just slide it over the nut and then lefty loosey and loosen it up. And then once it's loose enough, hopefully you can get it off with your hand here. Let me see. It looks like I can get it, but this has a ratcheting side. So I'm going to switch to the ratcheting side and ratchet it off. Looks like it's loose enough to get off with my hand, and it is. Now we're going to go back over to the driver's side and get that 17 millimeter nut off. So utilizing the box end side on the 17 millimeter wrench, I'm going to loosen it. I got it loose, and then see if I could back it off by hand. Nope, I'm going to have to go to the ratchet. I'm going to ratchet it off. Looks like it might be loose enough. There it is. And then now we have both sides disconnected. Now let's see if I could just pull this back. Might need a little persuasion, or you have to compress it a little bit. The stabilizer is fighting us a little bit, so we're just using a pry bar with a little persuasion here and see if we can pop it out. We're gonna have to work at this for a little bit. We're finding that the connection of the stabilizer bar to the steering arm, we can't just force it with a hammer. We've been tapping on the stud of the stabilizer. It's not budging. We got it in with a pry bar. It's not working either. So we're using a little puller from my OTC puller kit. We've got it underneath this part of the steering arm, and then we're going to apply force and hopefully be able to break this thing free. It's just not budging for us. Wow, that's really tight. I'm going to tap it with a hammer and see if I can break it free now. There's a lot of force on there. No dice. Still not budging. Okay. Need some more persuasion. My God. Is this supposed to fit in that freaking tight? Wow. Okay. I need the longer 19.
There you go. Holy shit. You guys said it was going to be a huge loud pop.
Man, this was no joke. This thing was on there super freaking tight, man. Since we know we're going to have to use a puller to break free the connection to this bracket, we're going to disconnect the bracket from the cross member. They're 14 millimeter bolts. I'm just using my little Dewalt gun to zip them out. Now this thing's going to drop as soon as I take this one off, so I'm going to hold the stabilizer. Now I got the whole thing. We're going to take this over to the bench vise and then pop it off of this bracket. We have the stabilizer bracket captured in my bench vise. I have a different style 2-jaw puller. If you're familiar with our videos, we've used this puller a lot to disconnect the outer tie rod from the lower ball joint on 3rd gen 4Runners. I have a long 19 millimeter ratcheting box end wrench on the spindle of the puller, and then I'm going to start applying force and it's going to break it free. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put this in front of here to where this thing isn't going to go flying at us. This is the setup, and now you're not going to be able to see it, but I'm going to protect ourselves by putting this on here so it doesn't go flying. Oh, and that was easy. It wasn't as crazy as the other side. That thing broke free nice. That was much easier. All right, now we just got to get the new one connected. So here's the hardware that comes with the OME steering stabilizer. You have a side that has a tapered shaft, and so the tapered shaft mimics the original stabilizer. You're going to come in from the same direction that the old one was connected on this back side. There is 2 distinct sides to this. The side that you connect up the steering stabilizer to has a larger protrusion on that side. There's a shorter flange on this side, so connect it up to the longer side. Stick the taper in first. You have a lock washer, and then you have a nylon lock nut. We pulled some instructions off of IHateMud.com, and we read that this nut should be torqued to 54 foot-pounds, so that's what we're going to do now. So this piece is already starting to spin on us. What we're going to try to do is try to set it into the bracket a little bit to where it bites. Let's see if that works. Nope, didn't work. Okay, so we're going to have to hold this steady. I think we're going to have to get on there with the channel locks and hold this to where we can get this tightened up, because the nylon lock nut has resistance to it and the whole thing wants to spin on us. So let's get on here with the channel locks. So hold it steady with the channel locks and let's see if we can get this tightened now. Once the nut comes in contact with the washer and starts putting pressure on the shaft, it shouldn't spin on us anymore. It's just because of the nylon lock nut, it's wanting to spin on us. Okay, it's biting now. Let me see if my theory is correct. Loosen up on this, Sean. Yep, it's holding. Okay, so now we're gonna transition to the torque wrench. Okay, I have my torque wrench set to 54 foot-pounds. Let's get this cinched up. There it is, 54 foot-pounds. So you're going to notice once you get it to 54 foot-pounds, you're still going to have a little bit of a gap here because the taper is only going to sink in so far to the bracket and it's going to lock in where it locks in. So it looks like maybe a little bit less than 1/4 of an inch. Now that we have this spindle attached to the bracket, we're going to slide over the stabilizer with the sleeve side onto the bracket. Then we're going to come in with a flat washer, and then we're going to come in with a nylon lock nut. Now the big question is, how tight do you tighten the nut that compresses the bushing for the stabilizer? So we're just going to have to use our best judgment, and once it's compressed quite a bit, we're probably going to stop. Well, it locked in right there. Let me see if I can get this to 54 foot-pounds. we noticed that the nut that attaches the stabilizer to the shaft, it loaded up, and we were able to get it to the spec of 54 foot-pounds on this side too. So that's the spec we decided to use, the same as this side. You just have to get it really tight in your bench vise to get it to the proper spec. So what we figured out is that once the washer bottoms out on this sleeve and you run out of threads, that's when you could hit the spec. So that's what we believe. It wasn't obviously the bushings getting it to the spec. It was the fact that the washer bottomed out on this shoulder of the sleeve, and then we were able to achieve the torque spec of 54 foot-pounds. So now we're going to do the same on the actual steering arm. We're going to come in with the tapered sleeve from this direction, from front to rear. We're going to get our lock washer on the back, and we're going to get our nylon lock nut on next. We're going to use the same technique that we did before. We're going to hold this part of the spindle, then we're going to tighten the nut with the flex head box end wrench. And then once the washer bottoms out, we'll be able to loosen our grip with the channel locks. Okay, that's loading up. Nice. The shaft isn't moving anymore, so now I could transition to my torque wrench. There we go. Finally. That was a workout. Now we could finally get this stabilizer in place. This is the side that's going to have to attach to here. Slide it over. And then we need to get our washer and our nut on. Washer and the nut. So now that we have the stabilizer bar connected up to this part of the steering arm, you're going to want to extend out the shock and line up these bracket bolts. This is how it connects up to the cross member. The bracket is in between the cross member and the stabilizer. We're going to line up our bolts and we're going to get those started. When you're doing this, just make sure that the bolts thread in nicely by hand. Don't cross thread them. Now we're going to torque these bolts to the spec of 29 foot-pounds. So I'm just again using my 3/8 inch torque wrench with a short 14 millimeter socket, and we're going to get these up to 29 foot-pounds. That one hit the spec, and that one hit the spec. Now that we have the bracket attached to the cross member and torqued to spec, the final thing we have to do for the stabilizer install is get this nut to the torque spec of 54 foot-pounds. Bottomed out. Let's see if we can get there. And there it is, 54 foot-pounds. So we are finally done with the front end of the vehicle. We have the shock absorbers replaced, the springs replaced, and that stabilizer shock replaced. Now we're going to work on the rear end and get those springs and shocks replaced. So we flipped the rig around to where the front end is now lower than the rear end. When we jack up the rear axle, we're not going to have the protections of the transmission in gear and the parking brake on, because that's all controlling the rear of the vehicle, not the front. So if you're following our lead and doing this at a slant, make sure that your front wheels are chalked with a quality set of chocks. And these chocks are really good. They're made out of recycled rubber and they grip the ground really, really good. So as we're jacking up the rear axle and the tires are coming clear of the ground, we're going to pay attention if the rig is holding. If the rig isn't holding, we're going to quickly drop it to the ground. But I've done this before in my driveway many times, and these chocks hold really well. In order to have more room to work on the back side, we're going to get the spare tire out of the way. And to get the spare tire lower to the ground, you got to utilize this OEM kit that comes with your Land Cruiser. It's a bunch of pieces that you got to put together. So this is the piece that's going to make contact with the actual contraption, the little winch that will lower the spare tire. This is the first piece. You're going to slide over the next piece. You'll see that there's a hole right here, and you've got this set nut. You set it over in this orientation, and then just hand tighten this nut. Next, we're going to slide over the next piece, and you're going to see that one side has a little spring and the other side has nothing. So the spring side faces this little hole. Slide it over, lock it in, and then tighten your set nut, and that's good to go right there. The next piece, the final piece, is you slide over this little T-handle. When you look at the back bumper, you're going to see a slot right here. And it's going to be hard to see where you need to go with this, but it's a little bit offset to the right. So if you get in here with a flashlight and get your head in there, you'll be able to see the slot that this hook goes into, to where you can start loosening the winch that lowers the spare tire. Once the tire's on the ground, you'll want to lower the chain just a little bit more to where you can get the end of the chain mechanism disconnected from the tire. So keep going down here. Okay, I think that's good enough. So once the chain is loose enough, you can rotate it and get it out from the tire. Just like this. Aaron's just raising this up a little bit to get it more out of our way. Okay, that's good. We're gonna slide the tire out from underneath the vehicle. So where we have the 6-ton jack stands on the frame is we have them right in front of the bracket that the lower control arm connects to. We have that set up on either side. With the frame resting on the 6-ton jack stands, we still have the hydraulic jack underneath the rear axle, because after we get the tires off, we're gonna lower the hydraulic jack and take pressure off the spring. So you want to keep your hydraulic jack underneath the axle because you need it for this procedure. So the instructions say to first disconnect the bolts that hold the shock absorber to the rear axle. So it's a 17mm bolt, and I'm going to use my Dewalt impact gun. Hey, what the hell?
No, it's not coming off?
No, it just seems like it's stripped. That's a lot of force. Hope nobody stripped this thing. Those threads do not look all that great. Now what we're gonna do is we're gonna take a pry bar and see if we can get it off this mount. So I'm just getting a pry bar in between the bracket on the axle housing and the body of the shock absorber. And I'm just prying outward, and that came off pretty easily. Now you're gonna see that this thing is just gonna extend like it's getting excited, getting ready for some fun. So the Land Cruiser has an interesting setup. It has this plate that attaches to the frame member, and it's held on by two 14mm bolts. So you can take this plate free and then take the shock absorber connected to the plate right off the vehicle. And so you don't have to work a ratchet up above. You could just take these off. So that's kind of cool. So I have a long extension with my 3/8 impact gun. Let's see if I can zip these out. No dice. My 3/8 impact gun wasn't up to the job. Let me see if I can break this free with this. Oh my God, this thing's tight. Might break my ratchet. There we go. Break them free a little bit first. To get onto this one, I'm using a wobble extension. It allows me a little bit of movement. If you had a traditional extension, you might not be able to get onto this. So it just is offering a little bit of movement. If you don't have a wobble extension, maybe you could use a swivel in its place. Okay, they're both loose. Now I'm gonna move back to the impact gun. I'm going to support the shock absorber because when the second one comes out, the whole thing should drop. There we go. So the way we're going to get this upper shock connection free of the bracket is we have the upper sleeve of the shock absorber captured in my bench vise. And you want to tighten it up to where it's kind of crushing the sleeve a bit to get a nice bite. If you didn't have a bench vise, then what you can do, which is the way we're gonna get the new shock absorber connected, is you can hold the top of the spindle firm, just like the front shocks. It has a flat side, so you can hold it firm, and then you can get underneath with a ratcheting wrench and get it loose. But because we have this captured in the bench vise, we think we could use my impact gun to zip this off, so we're gonna give it a try. It's a 19mm. Let's see if it works. That thing's freaking on there. Can you imagine how much energy you would have expended getting that thing off with a regular wrench? That was a lot of force. And this thing is really hot right now. It's kind of burning my fingers. So we should be able to pry this off. This washer that connects up to the top elastomer is really on there, so I think I have to twist it off with the channel locks. Let's see if I can get this thing off. I'm getting some movement. Man, this thing's on there. I'm just gonna keep on going counterclockwise and I'm gonna spin it off. Man, this thing's on there. Is it moving? I don't know if it's coming off. Man, this thing's on there. Plan B, I'm gonna pull up a little bit and see if I can pull this thing off. Taking some definite persuasion, that's for sure. Man, this thing's on there. Oh, we're getting it. Little twist, little wiggle, little twist, little wiggle. Ah. Jiminy Crickets, you lost. Give it up. There it is, finally. It's like a hard Saturday night. Thing didn't want to give it up. Okay, so now sliding this bracket off, we got to pay attention. So it has this special washer with a protrusion going on the inside, and then on the underside it has another special washer with the protrusion going in. You could see a side profile. It goes like that. So we have to remember that when we're getting the OME shock absorbers attached to this bracket. These OME rear shock absorbers come with a bushing that needs to be pressed in. I think if you had gorilla strength, like you maybe were Arnold Schwarzenegger during his heyday, maybe you can do this. But what we're gonna do is we're gonna lubricate this rubber bushing with a little bit of Mission Auto silicone paste, and then maybe we could slide it in with our hands. If it doesn't slide in with just hand strength, we'll use the bench vise to press it in. So I'm just gonna lubricate the bushing a little bit, and then I'm gonna lubricate the inside diameter of the shock absorber too. Now let's see if I have some good gorilla strength and I can press this in. Yeah, it's kind of hard to frickin' get it to where it's not moving around. Let's see if we can get this in the vise and it'll do it. Okay, start closing it down. Ooh, we got insertion. Oh!
That felt good.
Wow. So it looks like using a bench vise is a good way to go. Little lubrication helped it slide in. Just like lubrication can help you in other parts of your life. So now we're going to get this bracket attached to the top of the shock absorber. So the order of the parts is like so. You use another one of these washers, concave side facing up. Slide that on first. You get one of your bushings, slide that on next. Then you have this special washer with the protrusion facing upward. So you have the concave side of it facing the bushing. Next, you're gonna want to get your bracket slid over the top and the protrusion of that washer sitting in the inside diameter. We're gonna reuse this washer that came with the old shock absorbers. It will fit nicely right in this top part right here. Then we get another bushing, slide that over. We get another washer with the concave side facing the bushing. And then we get our top nut connected. And this, again, just like the front, is a nylon lock nut. Now we have to get this nut tightened to the torque spec of 51 foot-pounds. The OME shock absorbers come with a nut built into the spindle, so we can hold the spindle firm while we tighten the nut to the 51 foot-pound spec. But because this special Dumaflachi compressor thing is in the way, we're gonna take it off to where we can get on there with an open-end wrench easier. So I'm just gonna push this over the side and slip it off. And then slowly you're gonna notice that the shock absorber is just gonna gain length. It's getting excited and getting some blood flow. So that connection on the shaft of the shock absorber is a 19 millimeter nut size. Aaron's holding an open-end 19 millimeter on that section, and I have my torque wrench set to 51 foot-pounds with a deep 19 millimeter socket, and we're gonna torque this to spec. Okay, we're getting close. You got a good grip on it?
Yeah.
There it is, 51 foot-pounds. And we're gonna take notice here. How many threads are sticking up above? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 threads. 5 threads sticking up above the nut. Now that we have the shock absorbers set up and ready to go, the next thing we're gonna do is we're gonna disconnect the sway bar and The factory service manual says to disconnect it at 2 points where a bracket capturing a sway bar bushing is attaching it to the axle housing. Instead of doing that, we're going to do it a different way. We figured that we can just disconnect the sway bar at the end link connection, and that will be a little bit easier. At least that's our thought. So here's the end link connection to a bracket right here. It's a little dirty, so I'm just going to clean it off with a brush, and then I'm going to get in here with a little screwdriver. There's an Allen head connection to hold this spindle steady while you can get this loose if it starts spinning on you. So I'm just going to clean in here with the screwdriver, and that looks like it's pretty clean. This is a 19mm nut. I'm going to get on here and then see if it's going to hold and not spin. It's loosening, but it might be spinning on me. Let's see here. Let's get on here with this and see if the whole thing's spinning. Yep, the whole thing's spinning. So once this shaft starts spinning on you, what you do is you get on here with a ratcheting wrench. This is a 19mm. You get your Allen wrench in there holding the spindle firm, and now you can continue to back it off. If you don't hold the wrench, the whole thing turns with it. Okay, and since we got the other side disconnected, it might be a little easier to disconnect this one. It's flexing downward right now, and I have to push up a little bit and then pull it out. So I'm gonna get this washer off first. There we go. You want to be careful when you squeeze on the boot a little bit, it's going to push some of the grease out. So now that we have the sway bar disconnected on both sides of the vehicle, we're going to disconnect this lateral control arm. It's also considered a panhard bar. It says to disconnect it on the side that attaches to the axle, and this big bolt is a 24mm. So I'm going to zip this out with my gun. You'll want to have the axle housing pretty high, because when it's higher, there's going to be less stress on this. So you don't want to start removing this bolt with the axle really drooped, because there's a good chance as it's coming out, it's going to start going out crooked, and it might mess up the threads. So keep your rear axle jacked up pretty high.
Well, that was fucking awesome.
And it's not fully lined up to where we can get it out, so we're going to try to jack it up a little bit and see if we can slide it out. Jack it up a little higher. Still got tension on it. Keep going. There we go. So you just want to keep on jacking up on the axle housing until you can pull the bolt out. So now we've got this free, and this control arm won't hang up the rear end while we're drooping it to get the springs out. When the axle starts to droop, it looks like that this ABS bracket that holds the ABS line could contact this and stop the progression. So we're going to disconnect it at 2 points. There's one right here with the 12mm bolt, and then there's another one right here. There's one. I took this bolt out right here, so now we have a lot of movement in this ABS line. We're doing this just in case when we're flexing the rear end, some of these lines are going to get tight. Even though it doesn't look like the lateral control arm is going to contact this ABS line, maybe it's going to get stretched out as we flex the rear end really low. We're going to now disconnect some other connections. We're going to loosen this brake line bracket to where a lot of tension isn't placed on this line right here. We're also going to disconnect the parking brake right here on the top of the pumpkin to where this brake line is not going to get stretched out either. So we're going to get underneath the rig and disconnect these. So I'm going to zip out this one for the brake line. And you can see now that's going to offer us a little bit more movement as the axle droops. I have to slide underneath the vehicle further and get these ones that attach this parking brake bracket to the pumpkin. Oh, there we go. So now you can see there's a lot more movement, so we can droop the axle and not put strain on the parking brake cable. I'm going to slide this breather off of the axle. It has a clamp you could just easily squeeze with your hands, just like the front one. Slide that up, twist it, and pull up and get it loose. Okay, on this passenger side, as we drooped the axle, we noticed that this ABS line was getting stretched a bit, and we don't want to break anything doing this job. So we're going to disconnect it from these two brackets that are attached to this upper control arm. I'm going to use my gun and zip them out. We got a lot of movement, but we're just going to disconnect it in one other spot right here on this connection on the axle housing. we're gonna go ahead and finally disconnect the ABS line from this bracket right here on the end of the axle tube. Now we have a ton of movement. Aaron is drooping the axle. I'm just taking a second look, making sure nothing's getting flexed too much. This brake line's starting to get a bit tight. I think we're at the point where we can get these things in. Is that full droop?
Yeah, it's not even on the, it's not even on the jack.
It looks like there's not too much tension on this line. I think we can now flex each side and get the old springs out and the new springs in. Okay, so what we're doing is I'm gonna work on getting the spring disconnected. Aaron's gonna help me by standing on this brake caliper, and I'll see if I could sneak it out. Just like that. You'll notice that this isolator is staying put, and it's because it's held in with a bolt going in through here. We tested it out and it ends up it's a 12 millimeter. So if you wanted to replace this, you would come in with a long extension with a 12 millimeter socket, get on there, lefty loosey, and disconnect it. We're not going to be replacing these, so we're just going to keep them in place. What's out? So comparing up the new springs in the center with the old springs on the outside, this is driver side and this is passenger side. We're looking at the height. The driver side again is going to be the taller of the two springs, and OME labeled the taller spring with a B and they labeled the shorter spring with an A. So it's staying consistent with the front springs, labeled B on driver side, A on passenger side. So I misspoke, it's not an isolator, it's an insulator, and right up against the spring is this rubber piece. So if this drops out, put it back on top of the spring like this. On this driver's side, this stayed up there against the insulator, so we don't have to put that on. But on the passenger side, we're gonna have to make sure this goes on the top of the spring. So utilizing my little helper, he's gonna put his body weight on this and I'm gonna try to get this in place. The end of the spring is gonna go against a stop on the connection to the axle. So I have to pay attention to that when I'm getting it in place. So I'm gonna slide it up in here partially and he's gonna stand on there. Okay, stand on it again. Oh, there it is. Okay, so we have that side in place. Now we're just going to do the same with the other side. So like I said, I'm going to get this rubber piece on the top of the spring. I'm going to slide this over the insulator. Try not to drop this rubber piece multiple times. Okay, Aaron's going to step on the axle. There we go. You just want to make sure you have that rubber piece set equally on the top of the spring. Feels like it is. Now that we have both springs installed on both sides of the axle, the instructions say next to get the lateral control arm reconnected to the axle. And the way you do that to get the holes to line up is you have to jack the rear end up high enough to where the holes line up. So as this rear end goes up, you're going to see that the lateral control arm hole will line up with the hole in the axle. The rear end shifted a little bit towards the driver's side. I got in here with a pry bar, pried over a little bit to get it over. I'm using an extension now. Looks like it's lined up pretty good. I'm gonna have Aaron go up on the jack just a little bit more. It's not lined up yet. I'm gonna see if I could tap this in place with my mallet. That looks like it's lined up now. Threads aren't lined up. No. We tried to get the lateral control arm reconnected to the axle side, but the alignment has to be perfect, and we tried a bunch of different things and we can't get that bolt hole to line up perfectly. So what we're going to do is disconnect it on this passenger side connection, and then we're going to get the driver side connected first and then go back to this side. Because what we don't want to do is mess up the threads on that axle side, and this is going to prevent us from doing that. Our impact gun wasn't up to the task, so I got a big breaker bar connected up to a 24 millimeter socket onto the nut. Let's see if I can loosen this. Yep, I got it loose. Now that I have the 24 millimeter nut broken free, I'm gonna ratchet it out the rest of the way with my 1/2 inch drive ratchet. Now that we have the nut off, we're just going to tap this bolt out. So now with the lateral control arm free of the passenger side, hopefully I'm going to have an easier time lining this thing up. There we go. Okay, we got it started. Okay, that started pretty good. Now we're going to go back over to the passenger side and hopefully be able to get that bolt back in.
Looks like it's lined up on my side.
We've got it lined up. I'm just going to tap it in place now with the mallet. There we go.
Yeah, buddy.
Finally. We finally have the lateral control arm reconnected on both sides, and we're keeping the bolts loose because you want the weight of the vehicle on the tires, and then you want to tighten this down. So we're just going to leave everything loose right now. Now we're going to get the shock absorbers attached to the vehicle. When you took off the original shocks, it had this washer right here, and it goes on in this fashion with the flat side facing the elastomer of the lower shock and this concave side facing the bracket on the axle housing. So you slide that on first, then you get your shock absorber in place. What we noticed is that this bracket dips to the outside of the vehicle, so it's going to look like this on the vehicle with it dipping down this direction. We're on the driver's side right now. We're now going to get the shock absorber attached. We did a little trial and error, and we figured out that this one is hard to get started once the plate is in place. We got this one started a couple turns. Because of the bracket has a slot in it, we're going to come in at an angle. We're going to slip the bracket underneath this bolt on the outside, and then we got to rotate it in place. There we go. So once you have it in, then you can get the other one started easier. You got more room to work on this inside bolt.
That should be lined up.
Now that we have both bolts started, we're just cinching them up with a 3/8 ratchet and a long extension, 14 millimeter. Now that we have the upper bracket attached, we're going to get the shock absorber attached to the axle side. Compress the shock absorber and then slide it over just like that. Now with another special washer, concave side facing the head of the bolt, the flat side facing the bushing of the shock, get this started. The torque spec for this lower shock bolt is 47 foot-pounds. And there it is, 47 foot-pounds. Now we're going to torque these two upper 14 millimeter bolts that hold the bracket onto the frame. We're going to torque them to 37 foot-pounds. Now that we have both the shock absorbers onto the vehicle, we're going to get the rear sway bar connected at these end link brackets. So we have to kind of push inboard to clear the stud, and this is maybe why the factory service manual didn't say to do this, because it's a little bit difficult. But push back and then slide it in, and then get your washer and your nut back on. And before we tighten anything, we're going to go to the other side and get the other side connected. So this side is going to be a little bit tougher with the other side already connected. I'm pushing up and pushing in, and we got it hooked. So to get these cinched up, we utilized the same technique we used to get them off. We put a 17 millimeter ratcheting box end wrench on the nut first, held the spindle tight with a 6 millimeter Allen, and got them cinched up. Now what we're going to do is we're going to transition to a torque wrench and torque these end link nuts to 76 foot-pounds. I've got a deep 17 millimeter socket, and I got my 3/8 drive torque wrench, and we're going to torque this to 76 foot-pounds. There we go. Now we're going to do the same with the other side. So all the little 12 millimeter bolts we loosened and took out to disconnect the brake line and the ABS line. We're going to get all those reconnected. We're not going to bother showing it, because if you followed our lead, you knew where you took them out and you know where to get them back in. So we're just going to get all these little 12 millimeter bolts back connected for all these brackets. We have the tires back on. We have the weight of the rig on the tires. This is the point at which you want to torque the lateral control arm bolts to the spec of 180 foot-pounds. The reason why you don't tighten it up while it's in the air is because with any suspension component like a control arm, you want the control arm in a neutral position when you tighten it up, because if you don't tighten it up in the neutral position, then you're going to be binding the bushings. This is control arm tightening 101. You always want the weight of the rig on the tires. I've got my big 1/2 inch torque wrench with a 24mm socket, and I'm going to torque these to spec. There's that one. And we now have them both torqued to 180 foot-pounds. One fatal error that you don't want to do is forget to torque your lug nuts to spec. So we already torqued the front wheels to 85 foot-pounds, and before we forget and let Aaron drive down the road and lose a wheel, we're going to torque his lug nuts to 85 foot-pounds in the rear. All right, we are all done with this job. As you saw, there were a few little things that gave us a little bit of a curveball, but we figured it out. With the front suspension, what we noticed is it was a little bit harder to get that top shock nut off on the driver's side because the master cylinder was in our way, but we got around it, got it off, and then we were even able to torque it to spec using the crow's foot, so it worked out pretty good. We also got thrown a little curveball with the steering stabilizer. We didn't realize that we needed a puller to break it free from the steering arm and a puller to break it free from that bracket on the passenger side. We learned as we went and figured out that yeah, we needed a puller, and we broke it free, got the OME stabilizer hooked back up, and then it was pretty straightforward after that. For the rear suspension, a couple things gave us a curveball. Number one was the shock absorber brackets. We realized that it was easier to get that outside bracket bolt started, and then utilizing that cutout on the bracket, we hooked the bracket underneath the bolt. We got the shock absorber up there further, got the second bolt for the bracket on. Without getting that outside bolt started first, we were having trouble getting it lined up because there wasn't a lot of room to get your hand in there, and we tried with the long extension with the socket and still couldn't get the thread started. So we sort of believe that Toyota did that for a reason, gave a cutout on that bracket to where you can get your hand up there, get that outside bolt started, and then you could hook it with the bracket and then get the other one started. Once both shock bracket bolts were started, then we can compress the shock, slide it over the post, and then everything was pretty straightforward, and torquing all the bolts to spec. The other thing that gave us some difficulty is getting that bolt threaded back in on the axle side of the lateral control arm. We tried and tried and tried and couldn't get the threads lined up really well, and we were worried that we might end up cross-threading the bolt. So what we did is we decided to disconnect the passenger side, get the lateral control arm completely free of the vehicle, get that driver's side bolt screwed in a little bit first, and then we got the long bolt on the passenger side connected, and then everything worked out well from there. So those were the little hang-ups you saw that we had doing this job. What I didn't say at the beginning of this video is all the steps we did to do a suspension refresh on Aaron's Land Cruiser. It would be the same steps if you were doing a suspension lift. The only difference is you're going to have a little bit more difficulty getting the springs into position because now those springs are longer. So you're going to need a little more flex from both the front and rear axle to get those springs into position. If you found this video, hopefully it helped you install the lift on your FJ80 Land Cruiser too. With all that said, thank you for watching Toyota Time with Timmy the Toolman and Sean and special guest Aaron. Thank you for watching. Thank you for subscribing. If you have any questions or comments, do that below. Take care. Bye-bye. Sick mods. Sick FJ80 Land Cruisers. And happy wrenching, people. Peace out. Bye-bye.